Moving on now, hours after Ukraine urged NATO nations to supply more weapons, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that a number of NATO countries have agreed to ramp up weapon supplies to Ukraine to help in its fight against Russia. Here's more.
Spurred into action by reports of atrocities in Ukraine, NATO countries have agreed to ramp up the supply of weapons to Kiev, including high-tech arms, amid concerns that Russia is about to launch a large offensive in eastern Ukraine. NATO has refused to send troops to Ukraine or police any no-fly zone to prevent Russia from completely overwhelming its neighbor.
We agreed that we must further strengthen and sustain our support to Ukraine so that Ukraine prevails in the face of Russia's invasion. We agreed that we must support other regional partners under pressure, and we agreed to step up cooperation with our partners in the Asia-Pacific because the crisis has global ramifications. Allies utterly condemned the horrific murders of civilians we have seen in Bucha and other places recently liberated from Russian control. All the facts must be established, all those responsible for these atrocities must be brought to justice, and allies are supporting efforts for an international investigation.
But individual member countries are supplying anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons, as well as equipment and medical supplies. NATO has also raised the possibility of providing training outside of the war-ravaged country, as the alliance prepares to send modern arms to Ukraine to defend their territory.
Ministers also addressed our future relations with Russia. The sanctions introduced by NATO allies and our partners are unprecedented, and they are damaging President Putin's war machine. We need to continue coordinated pressure to help end this senseless war. Ministers agreed that NATO's next strategic concept must deliver a response on how we relate to Russia in the future. And for the first time, it must also take account of how China's growing influence and coercive policies affect our security.
Meanwhile, the United States says that sickening images and accounts coming out of Bucha and other parts of Ukraine have strengthened the West's resolve to punish Russia and step up support for Ukraine.
So one of the reasons that Ukrainians have been able to be so effective in pushing back this Russian aggression, of course it starts with their extraordinary courage, but it's also because they already had in hand the weapons necessary to do that. And then since the aggression, we have repeatedly and continuously, along with many allies and partners, supplied them with the most effective systems that we believe they need to deal with the armored vehicles, to deal with the tanks, to deal with the planes, to deal with the helicopters. But as I just said, we are looking at day in, day out, what we believe they most need, to include new systems that have not heretofore been provided. We're listening to them in terms of their assessment of what they need. We're putting that all together, and we're proceeding. And we have a strong sense of urgency. That was something that I think was felt among all allies and partners here.
Meanwhile, some of the countries sending weapons are making a distinction about the kind of support they can provide. Some NATO members argue Ukraine should only receive arms that can be used for defensive purposes and not warplanes or tanks that might allow the country to take the offensive. Some member nations fear the alliance could be dragged into a larger conflict with nuclear-armed Russia. Despite the allegations of war crimes and warnings that atrocities might come, it appears unlikely, at least for now, that the world's biggest security alliance will agree as an organization to send troops to Ukraine in order to end Europe's biggest land war since 1945. Agency Report, Republic TV.